This is a 1992 Mercedes-Benz 500E, and it looks like every other Mercedes-Benz E-Class from its era, except this one has a secret. It was built by Porsche. Yes, that's right. If you think the Panamera was the first sedan Porsche built, you're wrong. They also built a Mercedes sedan in the 1990s, and it was the 500E. And today, I'm going to review this one. I've borrowed this 500E from Elite Finish, which is a shop here in San Diego that does pretty much anything cosmetic that you can think of: detailing, tints, ceramic coating, clear bras, wraps, basically anything. Elite Finish has a great reputation here in San Diego, and they get some of the coolest cars. And that includes this. The story of the 500E is quite an interesting one. Mercedes-Benz wanted to stick the 5-liter V8 from the SL sports car into the E-Class. Now that was a big deal at the time because there was no factory Mercedes AMG cars. No one was putting V8 engines into mid-size sedans, especially ones that typically came with a 4-cylinder or a 6-cylinder or a smaller diesel engine like this era of the E-Class. At the same time, in the early 1990s, Porsche was teetering near collapse with poor sales and serious financial difficulties. So Mercedes-Benz hired Porsche to engineer a way to get the V8 into the E-Class sedan, giving Porsche some work when they desperately needed it. The result was the 500E, and when it was completed, they discovered it was too wide to be built on the same Mercedes-Benz assembly line with the other E-Class models. So Mercedes-Benz also hired Porsche to build the 500E, which helped save Porsche from bankruptcy in the early 1990s. And so this is a sedan that was built by Porsche, even though it has a Mercedes badge. Now, it was sold here in North America from 1992 to 1994, and the 5-liter V8 made about 320 horsepower, which was more than the BMW M5 from the time period. So today, I'm going to take you on a tour of the 500E, and I'm going to show you all of its interesting quirks and features.
And by the way, this 500E is for sale. Click the link below to check out the owner's Instagram page, and you can follow him or message him directly if you're interested in buying it.
Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the 500E with one of this car's most memorable quirks, and that would be the flared fenders. Now, this was always intended to be a low-volume car, and so Mercedes didn't want to go to the trouble of figuring out how to stuff this big V8 under the hood of a car that was never intended for it. So Mercedes-Benz brought on Porsche for the engineering, and Porsche figured out a way to get the V8 under there, but it meant they had to flare out the fenders a couple extra inches in order to accommodate it. Now, the story goes that the result of these wider fenders to accommodate the V8 was that the car became too wide for Mercedes-Benz to build it on the normal E-Class assembly line, and so Porsche also decided to build the 500E for Mercedes-Benz, and that's how it happened. But either way, the wider fenders are important because it is the only way you can tell on the outside of this car that this was different from your regular, typical E-Class. You're driving along, you saw one of these, and unless you knew that extra inch or two on the fenders, you just thought you were coming up to an E220 diesel until the light turned green. Now, of course, there was one more way you could tell apart the 500E from the standard E-Class of the time, and that was the badge on the trunk that said 500E, with 500, of course, standing for the 5-liter V8. But that was it. Otherwise, this car was dramatically more subtle than the BMW M5 from this era, which used a 6-cylinder. And this car was more powerful. Now next up, when you get under the hood in the 500E, you can really tell why it was such a challenge to get this engine in here and why Mercedes-Benz needed some outside help to make it happen. This V8 is really stuffed into this engine bay, and it really takes up basically every inch of available space. Although it became common later for E-Class models to have a V8, the W124, as this generation of E-Class was called, it was a pretty narrow car, and it really was never intended to have 8 cylinders when it was first designed. And next up, since I'm on the outside of the 500E, I want to discuss another interesting quirk, and that would be the mirrors, and specifically the fact that the driver mirror is this fairly normal horizontal looking mirror, but the passenger mirror is different. It's vertical. Now, this isn't a mistake. These mirrors were different shapes to give you different views. The driver's side mirror was shaped like this to let you see what was on the driver's side. The passenger side mirror was taller because it was thought that that gave you a better view of the passenger side blind spot. And so all E-Class models from this era have these two differently sized mirrors. Very unusual. You don't see that today. But when it came to mirrors, this car had an even quirkier quirk than them being different sizes, and that was how the mirrors were adjusted. All right, check this out. You want to adjust the driver mirror. There's this little handle coming off the mirror on the driver's side, and you move it around. That's pretty simple, nothing unusual there. But if you want to adjust the passenger mirror, there's a little joystick in the center console. You move that around and the passenger mirror automatically adjusts. So while your car has power mirrors, the 500E had power mirror, singular. Now that's interesting, but there is an even quirkier item in the center console than the single power mirror adjuster, and that would be the phone. Open up the center console storage area and there is a phone in here, and it dials. I have been in a lot of cars that had built-in car phones. They never work, but this one dials. Unfortunately, it also doesn't work, but it's closer than all the other phones I've ever seen installed in cars. It will actually dial and make the little beeping sounds, which almost seems like it works. Now next up, amazingly, there was an even quirkier phone-related item inside this car than the actual phone, and that would be this little panel above the rearview mirror on the ceiling. It was a phone shortcut panel. You can see there are buttons M1 and M2. That was your memory. You would set memory 1, that was your spouse, and then you could just press M1 without having to dial the full number, press send, and it would call. So this was an easier way to dial commonly dialed numbers from your phone without actually having to go in and dial each individual number. This panel also had a couple of other interesting items aside from those memory call buttons. You had an end button up here so you could end a call without having to reach down to your phone in the center console. You also have this little screen here which I think showed you how long you've been on the call, if you have service, that kind of thing. And there was a little microphone in this panel, and I guess that's where you talked into to speak on your phone. Now, as cool as this phone is, and as cool as it probably was in 1992 to have a car phone in here, there was a serious problem with this phone, specifically the fact that it took up the entire center console. Now I say that's a problem because this car doesn't have a glove box. So instead, they gave you the center console storage area with this slidey back lid and a key lock. But then if you got the car phone, your center console storage area was taken up too, so there was nowhere to put anything. You had a mid-size regular sedan with no storage. You couldn't even find a slot for your registration papers, which was kind of an issue. And next up, I want to move on to some other interesting interior quirks and features. I'm going to stay in the center console where you have a little plastic switch between the window switches, and if you flip it, it reveals a little man. Now, when you have the windows in little man reveal mode, then the rear passengers cannot roll down their windows. So I guess that's the child window lock. I personally just like the little man graphic. Now next up, also in that center console area, another unfamiliar piece down there, there's a little dial between the window switches. That dial would allow you to choose where you wanted the music balance coming out of the speakers. So if you pushed it all the way up, you would just hear the music out of the front speakers, and if you pushed it all the way back, then you would just hear the music out of the rear speakers, or you could leave it in the middle and it would sort of balance between both. Now next up, another interesting item. This car had quite a few rather unusual buttons. I'm going to go through them now. In the center control stack, probably the most unusual is this button with a donut on it. That is the snow chains button, and I guess when you put snow chains on this car, you would press that button to let the car know, and then it would kind of change its driving characteristics to be compatible with your snow chains. So that is not a sugar donut on that button. That is in fact a snow tire. But that's not the only unusual button. How about the one over on the left with a seat on it? You press that and it drops the rear headrest automatically. That gave you more visibility in case there were no rear passengers. Unfortunately, you can't press that button to lift the headrest back up. If you want the headrest back up, you have to manually go back there and actually pull them into place. This button only dropped them. You also have a button up here to control the rear sunshade. Yes, this car had a rear sunshade. You press this button and then the sunshade would whir into place, thereby creating a little shade for the rear passengers. Now next up, another interesting item in the center control stack was the climate controls, and specifically the fact that they operate like a whack-a-mole game. Check this out. If you press the button to choose where you want the air to come out, then the previous button pops up, and you can just keep pressing buttons and popping up previous buttons. It's an interesting way to allow the front passengers to choose where the air is coming out. Now next up, another unusual climate control is over on the left, and that would be this dial that allows you to select the air temperature. Right now it's blue, so it's going to be blowing out cold air, but if you adjust the dial, you can get it to white, which is, I guess, medium air, and then eventually to red, which is warm air. Kind of a strange way to change the air temperature by modern standards. One other unusual thing about the climate controls is the fact that you have only 3 different fan speeds. It's over on the right, and you have low fan speed, you have high fan speed, and then you have automatic fan speed, automatic climate control. That's it. There's no dial to adjust your fan speed exactly to your liking. You just have to go with one of these options. Now, aside from all the interesting quirks and features in this car, it's worth noting that this car was pretty advanced for 1992. It had quite a few modern luxuries and conveniences. For instance, it had dual airbags, an airbag on the driver's side and on the passenger side. Not too many cars had that in 1992. It also had power seats, which is pretty good, but that included a power headrest. You press this little button in the power seat controls, and the headrest would automatically move up and down. Pretty nice luxury touch. And you had heated seats. These little buttons in the center console would turn on 2 different stages of heated seats. And next up, we move on to the back seats in the 500E. You open the back door, and the very first thing you notice is this little storage cubby. The back seats have a storage cubby between the seat and the door where they can stick stuff. Now the front seats, they don't have a glove box, and the center console is taken by the phone, but the rear seat passengers, they have some storage options. Now the next thing you notice back here right away is that there are only 2 back seats. This is not a bench seat. You have bucket seats back here, and in the center you have a large center console. So this is only a 4-seater car, just like the original Panamera, which was kind of an interesting thing. Now, of course, you're probably wondering what exactly takes up that space where the middle seat would have been, where the middle seat was in all the other E-Class models from this era. And the answer is, well, for one thing, there's storage. If you roll back this wood panel, you can see there's a nice little storage compartment in the middle between the seats. Or you go to the seat back in the center and you can drop down this nice armrest to increase the comfort of the rear seat passengers. Or in the front of this center console, you have an ashtray, which is nice if you want to smoke in back. Although it's worth noting there is also an ashtray on the door on the driver's side and another ashtray on the door on the passenger side, meaning there are 3 ashtrays back here for 2 rear seats. And these are the rear seats. This is where your children will be. But fortunately, if your children take up smoking, they have many places to discard their ashes. Another interesting item back here is the coat hanger, or the grab handle, which is like twice the size of the one in front. You can see it's much larger, longer in the back than it is in the front, I guess so you could stick even more coats in the back. And next up, the other interesting item in the back seats would be the first aid kit. You may be wondering where that's located. Well, that's on the rear shelf, of course. You can pop it open and experience all the best in 27-year-old first aid supplies. Now, speaking of that first aid kit on the rear parcel shelf, another interesting item on that parcel shelf is the third brake light. You can see it from inside. It looks like they just tacked it on there, and that's because they did. This car came out before the requirement that mandated a third brake light, and then that requirement showed up, and they were like, what do we do? So they just kind of stuck one in there, and that's where it lives. Very much looks like an afterthought. Speaking of interesting lighting items with this car, though, one unusual one in the front is the wipers. This car has windshield wipers for the headlights. Not very common today, but some Mercedes-Benz models had it back in the 90s, and this is one of those cars. Now, this is made even more unusual by the fact that there is only one windshield wiper for the windshield. It's called the mono wiper. You turn it on and it wipes the whole windshield with just one wiper. So there were two wipers for the headlights, but only one wiper for the actual windshield. An interesting case study in engineering priorities, but that's what they've done here. And next up, another interesting item on the outside of this car, the badge on the back. I mentioned before that 500E badge, pretty much the only way you can tell this car apart from regular E-Class models. It's worth noting that Mercedes-Benz changed all their model names in 1994 to put the letter first instead of the numbers. That was during this car's production run. So the early 500E models are called 500E, but beginning in 94, it was called the E500. Just kind of depends on what model year your 500E E500 is from. Now, speaking of the back of the car, let's talk trunk for a minute. You open the trunk and you will find that it is a trunk. Nothing at all unusual, interesting, special in here, except for the fact that it includes a CD changer. This was a factory original CD changer included with this car. And again, pretty forward thinking for 1992. Almost all cars in 92 didn't even have a CD player. This thing had a changer in the trunk. You bought this car, you were getting a lot of cool stuff. And so those are the quirks and features of the Mercedes 500E. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the 500E. Now, one interesting thing about the 500E, specifically with me reviewing it, I actually owned a 1993 500E for a little while. It was in really nice shape, not quite as nice as this, and then I kind of flipped it as they were going up in value. And that's one of the things about this car, it is going up in value, just like basically anything that has Porsche on it. This car is kind of seen as a bit of a Porsche, and so values have started to really climb as Porsches have become more collectible. Nice examples of 500Es are now selling for $30, $40, $50,000+, really low mileage ones, even higher than that. One thing I always didn't like about the 500E was the seats. They are laughably unsupportive. For a performance car, it's almost hilarious and stupid. They are flat, basically. They're comfortable, but this was intended to be a performance car, and you just kind of slide around in corners. As for the performance of this car, I have owned an embarrassing number of high-performance E-Class models. I had the 500E, then I had the E55 that came out next, then the E63 that came out after that, and then the E63 that came out after that. I'm on my fourth high-performance E-Class right now. And this car, I always thought, was a good example of how a dynasty kind of starts, which is to say it was good, but it was not fully refined. So when you floor it, it's pretty quick. For a car from this era, this thing hauls. 330 horsepower and a V8, a car this size, not all sorts of modern gadgets and equipment to make it heavy. This car went pretty well. Now, it had a 4-speed automatic. It was not the greatest transmission for that stuff. It didn't handle tremendously well. E-Class models got far, far more athletic right after this one, but especially up to the modern era. Now they're like sports cars. This thing was better than a regular E-Class, but not dramatically. It was not particularly sharp, not particularly precise. It was just fine. Basically, what they did was they had this idea to stick a V8 in an E-Class, see what happened, and it worked pretty well. And so the next one, they refined it more. They went with a sportier engine. They did a few more styling cues. They did more to the suspension. And over the years, they've just been refining it. But this car wasn't that. This was not the final evolution. It was just sort of the beginning. As a result of that, I've been watching the values in these cars climb, and I've been kind of puzzled by it. It's just not the world's greatest driving car. And if it wasn't for the fact that it was built in Zuffenhausen instead of 8 miles away, where Mercedes was building the E-Classes, this car wouldn't be that valuable. And so by modern standards, it's not the most fun car to drive. The fun of this car comes more in the story, the Porsche connection, and just kind of, you know, the special if you know, with the flared fenders and the low production number. Now, that's not to say this is not a good car. The era of Mercedes-Benz when this car came out was probably the peak of Mercedes-Benz quality. Very, very sturdy, solid cars, and this vehicle feels like that. And so that's the Mercedes 500E. This may look like a regular 1990s E-Class, but it's a far more special car than that. And while I personally think that the E55 AMG that came next was a far better high-performance E-Class, you have to respect this car and its crazy story, sticking a V8 into a mid-size sedan that was built just yards from where Porsche was putting together the iconic 911. Anyway, that's the 500E, and now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the 500E looks nice enough. The changes over regular models are too subtle for most people, but they're still cool, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 5.9 seconds, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Handling is okay. I'm surprised it's not sharper considering this car's pedigree, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is relatively low. Aside from the history and acceleration, it's really just a fairly docile Mercedes sedan, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Cool factor is okay. Most people won't know what it is, but some do, and they'll think it's really cool. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 24 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It was reasonably well equipped for its time, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is only okay, a little better than average, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Quality is strong. This is a tremendously reliable engine, but also the car is just solidly built. The only drawback is somewhat average interior materials by modern standards, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Value is good. 5 years ago, I would have given it an 8 or a 9, but 500E prices are rising, and now it's down to a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 28 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 52 out of 100. I've never reviewed any close competitors to the 500E, but here it is against a few somewhat similar cars from its era. The 500E is an excellent sedan with a special history, and I bet nice ones like this will continue to increase in value and collector interest.